The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. I really don't think I can live up to that. You put a lot of pressure on me here. I would like to say before I start that I think the Blount program in which I had Lizzie as a student is the finest program on campus and the closest thing to an ideal educational experience that you can get. So, and one of the best parts of it is the kind of students that it attracts. And Lizzie's a good example of that. But there were a great many more that I could mention, but it's a wonderful thing. It's been a great opportunity for me, and it's helped me to rejuvenate my own excitement about teaching. Before doing anything else, though, I want to thank all the students who were responsible for giving me the opportunity to speak to you tonight as the last lecture in the last lecture series. I can think of no greater honor that the University of Alabama could confer upon me. My charge tonight is to speak to the students of the university as if for the last time. It would be easy and safe for me to merely reminisce about my career, tell uplifting stories of teaching successes, and promise a hopeful future for all who sit before me. But this is not the way I've taught for the last 30 years. And I know that this is not the reason I was selected to speak to you tonight. The students who made my appearance possible expected me to discuss some of the important themes that have shaped my teaching in recent years. I believe these themes go to the heart of what we are about in the university today. They have implications for the kind of society that we will become. I want to speak to you not merely as the students you are today, but as who you are destined to become tomorrow, the people who will determine the course our society will take in the remainder of the 21st century. If I were to summarize briefly the argument I plan to make, it might go something like this. Scientific thinking has become the dominant way of thought in our world because it appears to have achieved measurable progress while other approaches to life have not. Because of its dominance, however, we have begun to employ it in places where it cannot help us and where it may even be counterproductive or dehumanizing. Education is one of those places where we have often adopted science and the technology it has spawned to the detriment of education's proper ends. At the same time that we have begun to deify science, we have become disillusioned with human beings and human nature. We have become unwilling to accept the inevitable failings and the limitations of human life. We have sought scientific certainty where it cannot be had, in a perfection that life doesn't allow. And in so doing, we have diminished ourselves and endangered some of our most cherished values. Before elaborating on this argument, I should say at the outset that I am no Luddite, though people who don't know me well often see me as one. The Luddites, you will recall, were British handloom weavers who, seeing their lives drastically altered by the Industrial Revolution, expressed their anger by smashing the new power looms that had replaced them. I must admit, there have been times when I've been frustrated enough with my computer to be tempted to throw it out of my office window. But I'm also well aware of the manifold material benefits that modern science has bestowed upon us. I have no desire to abandon my Honda for a horse, return to medieval medical care, or give up the delightful convenience of Wikipedia. Perhaps you should also know that I am justifiably proud of the family I was born into, a family made up almost completely of chemists, engineers, and computer scientists. At least in some respects, I didn't fall far from this tree. When I was a freshman in college, I took a battery of aptitude and interest tests, which had conclusive, if problematical, results. My highest aptitude scores were always in math, chemistry, and physics, while my interest test consistently showed these to be the fields in which I had the least interest. When I went to a counselor to seek help, his advice was clear and succinct. Get interested in math, chemistry, or physics. Yet I decided to pursue a career in history and have never regretted it for an instant. I suppose this wasn't the first or the last time in my life that my heart triumphed over my head with very good results. Everything around us testifies to the fact that we live in the age of science. In the past 2 centuries, scientific advances have made agriculture and industry so productive that the world enjoys an unprecedented level of abundance and material comfort. Revolutions in transportation and communication have allowed us to travel readily to the remotest corners of the earth, all the while maintaining contact with the people we care about back home. But these advances seem almost quaint when compared to today's more fundamental scientific frontiers of genetics, robotics, information technology, and nanotechnology. Every morning now, it seems, we turn on our computers and learn of the latest innovation that will make some aspect of our current life obsolete. Given these facts, it is no wonder that scientists today have a powerful sense of their own importance. Nor perhaps should we be surprised to discover that some have begun to believe that the scientific method was now set to unravel all the knotty problems of human existence. One of Alabama's own favorite sons, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biologist Edward O. Wilson, clearly displays this tendency of mind in his book, Consilience. In this work, he imperialistically claims all knowledge for science and confidently asserts that one day scientists will explain the nature of art, literature, and music in the same way and according to the same materialistic laws that it has used to explain the electromagnetic spectrum. He also predicts that what he calls the illusions of morality and religion will eventually be defeated by the unconquerable power of empiricism. Man, in Professor Wilson's restricted universe, is nothing but a complicated machine. Sadly, this overweening pride in science and its acolytes now coexists in our world with a loss of faith in humanity itself. As science and technology have ascended in our estimation, human beings have allowed themselves to be thrust into a subordinate role. The inherent dignity of man that lay in the great religious traditions, the belief in the individual that rose with the Renaissance, the hopes that were excited by the Enlightenment's faith in human reason have fallen on hard times. In the 19th century, reformers still had the confidence to speak openly of the perfectibility of man, but our age has become disillusioned and dissatisfied with what mere human beings can do. Stalin, Hitler, and the Holocaust may account for some of this loss of faith in the possibilities of human progress in the 20th century. More recently, continued economic crashes and political failures have dimmed our hopes that man's creation of free economic markets or democratic political institutions might bring about the millennium. Today, only science promises to fulfill human dreams for a future far better than the past that we have known. In our own time, we see evidence everywhere of the dissatisfaction with people as they are and the turning to science to rectify our deficiencies. The 21st century has become an age of intense competition among people and nations. And it is often in the most competitive arenas that we can see the frontiers of this trend. Cyclists and runners use blood doping to achieve unnatural endurance. Baseball and football players resort to steroids to achieve levels of strength and speed never before possible. People who compete primarily with their minds have begun to engage in what has been called brain doping, the use of specific drugs to improve their mental focus and stamina beyond natural limits. Other drugs, ones that alter our natural moods, are prescribed today more than those for any other purpose. Cosmetic surgery increasingly provides us with the physical beauty that God somehow overlooked. Some scientists, financed by the government, are attempting to go even further. They are working to create human beings who have no physical, physiological, or cognitive limitations. An institution known as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is working to create people who are impervious to pain and can perform without sleep so that our soldiers can become a master race of unconquerable warriors. Everywhere, it seems, people are coming to the conclusion that natural human beings are just not good enough for today's demanding purposes. But the world we inhabit, higher education, is also one of society's most competitive realms. Students compete to get into college and for grades, honors, scholarships, and entrance to graduate schools once they do. Their professors vie for their jobs, their scholarly reputations, promotions, raises, and the holy grail of tenure. Colleges themselves compete for students and for money. In order to obtain these, they compete for rankings, both in academics and athletics. Given these conditions, we might expect to find in higher education the same exaltation of the ways of science and the same disillusionment with the limitations of mere human beings, and we would be right. But here the implications of these trends are even more important. For it is in the universities that we cultivate the people who will in turn shape future generations. To take the wrong course here will have profound implications because what we do here today will resonate for decades to come. I will argue tonight that current educational trends are making many serious mistakes that, if not remedied, will adversely affect the kind of world our children will live in and the kind of people they will become. Among these mistakes are the unfounded deification of science, the wrong-headed valuing of technique over substance, the misguided worship of technology, the dehumanizing practice of reducing people to numbers, the mindless preference for the new over the old, and the fallacy of equating the real and the virtual. By far the most serious problem, however, is the hubris displayed by those who advocate these misguided ideas. The scientific mind, because it lays claim to truth, usually expressed with the phrase, "studies have shown," is often prone to the kind of arrogance, intolerance, and self-righteousness that it usually condemns in religious people. In a lamentable lack of faith in the freedom, tolerance, and diversity that should be typical of university life, educational leaders have begun to compel professors to adopt the latest techniques and gadgets that the educational establishment has sanctified. I wish America's educational leadership had a little more humility and a little more faith in the bright, well-educated, caring people who teach in today's universities. If they are so certain that the ways of teaching they advocate are superior, why don't they trust the talented young PhDs they hire to discover this for themselves? And if, as they so often like to assert, these changes are inevitable, why do they believe coercion is necessary to hurry them along? I don't believe that many of the educational changes being pushed today are a step forward, nor do I believe they are inevitable. The mere fact that they are being imposed by power rather than induced through persuasion suggests that this truth is obvious to all. There is no way that I can explain all these changes and develop fully my objections to them in the time I have tonight. But as I often tell my students, anything worth doing is worth doing superficially. How then is the scientific mind reshaping education? First, the scientific mind is reductive. It wants to break everything down into its constituent parts. There is nothing wrong with reductive thinking in the sciences, but when discussing human beings and human societies, the problem is that it cannot properly be done. You always have important things being left over. Human beings and human endeavors are always more than the sum of their parts. In education, this kind of reductive thinking leads administrators to demand that professors break down their courses into finite little packets of knowledge and skills called, in the redundant bureaucratic jargon of the educational establishment, goals and objectives. But to reduce the study of subjects like art or history to petty, precisely defined purposes is a fool's errand. How can the aims of any important subject be reduced to a few bullet points? How can one possibly state definitively what a student should learn from studying the plays of Shakespeare? How can one compile a comprehensive list of objectives for a course that examines the whole span of Western civilization? When such reductive silliness first developed, it was not terribly harmful. Instructors usually drafted a few ambitious-sounding statements to satisfy the bureaucracy and then promptly and justifiably ignored them. The process was usually just a waste of one's time and some space on one's syllabus. But now professors are commonly compelled to do what are called outcomes assessments. In the name of accountability, they are told to reduce the bullet points of their reductive goals and objectives to a series of test questions whose answers can then be counted, analyzed, and compared. But the reduction of general aims to precise goals and objectives, the reduction of these goals and objectives to constant testing, and the further reduction of the test results to mere numbers of dubious meaning are wasteful, corrupting, and destructive of proper teaching and learning. Such practices introduced to American higher education, once the glory of the world, the petty bureaucratic ways of our failed public school system. Isn't it obvious that if forced into this process, professors will construct goals that are easily achieved, tested for, and counted? The whole educational process will be debased by the necessity to constantly reduce one's aims and test for them. Students will be shortchanged by the focus on only testable skills and knowledge. Professors will be corrupted by the need to demonstrate student success to retain their jobs or seek advancement. They will certainly achieve this success by requiring easily obtainable outcomes, by conniving with the students, or simply by faking the results, just as is done in the public schools today. Meanwhile, what will happen to the often intangible but more important parts of what we are trying to teach? I can ask students in my Civil War course to know that the country contained 4 million slaves in 1860. But how can I test whether they fully comprehend the injustice of even one human being owning another? I can expect them to know that Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was defeated at Gettysburg. But how can I be sure that they really understand the crushing burden of leadership that Lee felt when he met the shattered remnants of Pickett's charge with his courageous admission, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." I can demand that my students know how Lincoln was reelected in 1864. But no outcomes assessment can reveal their human comprehension of the depth of Lincoln's mercy when, in his timeless second inaugural, he asked a country that had suffered 4 years of bitter civil war to have malice toward none and charity for all. What will happen to this kind of knowledge when bureaucratic necessities force both students and teachers to focus their attention on less important but more testable information? Those who seek to make education perfect will only succeed in making it petty. But the scientific mind wants certainty. It cannot believe that there is worthwhile knowledge that cannot be reduced to simple elements that students can then be tested on. It wants a result that can be weighed, measured, or counted. It wants everything to be prepackaged and predictable so that a student enrolling in a course will be promised a precise product that can be neatly boxed up and carried home with him or her at the end of the semester. But to tell students exactly what they should know and how it should be organized, to tell them exactly what is important and what isn't, is to save them the burden of thinking. But you get what you pay for. What you don't work hard to acquire will neither educate nor endure. Of course, if teachers do sort everything out for students, their lives will be easier, they will be happier, and they will appear to know more at the end of your course. Yet such knowledge will not burden them long. When they eventually confront the world, unaccompanied by a helpful guide bearing PowerPoints, they will be baffled and lost. You can teach for today and appear a success, or you can teach for tomorrow and actually be one. The scientific mind also worships technique. And like the famed efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor, it tends to believe that these techniques can be reduced to a science, as Taylor did with shoveling coal at the Midvale Steel Factory. But educating human beings is not shoveling coal. Whether one uses the lecture, the discussion, film clips, PowerPoints, handouts, active learning, collaborative learning, peer editing, classroom laptops, or clickers should never be compulsory, but ought to be left up to the instructor. Any or all of these practices might have merit, but that merit will depend on the subject taught, the person teaching, and the students being taught. One cannot teach history with the same techniques as physics. Moreover, professors are different people, and they must use the techniques that suit them. And as all good professors know, every class has its own chemistry, and what may work with one set of students may not work with another. Moreover, today's obsessive concern with the means of education diverts us from the more urgent subject of its proper ends, and often does great damage to these ends in the process. At the dawn of American culture, Ralph Waldo Emerson addressed young historians with the admonition, "Don't read to me a list of the books that you have read, but make me feel the ages you have lived." Today's educational establishment might paraphrase Emerson this way: don't read to me a list of the books that you have read, but tell me of your course objectives, your educational techniques, and the composite statistical analysis of student achievement relating to the rubrics on which they are tested. I leave you to contemplate whether we should consider this as progress. We should also remember that every technique and every technology has consequences for both teachers and students. We shape people by how we teach them as well as by what we teach them. I recently observed a class that was a perfect model of the kind of teaching that is being imposed by the modern university. The class involved lecturing, discussion, film clips, PowerPoints, handouts, collaborative learning, and the use of clickers, all in 50 minutes. No part of this melange lasted for more than a few minutes. The lights went off and then on again. The students talked and then fell silent. The instructor spoke, then became a spectator of his own film and PowerPoint. All that was missing were the laser light show and the 3D glasses. Don't get me wrong, it was masterfully done. It was well planned, and the plan was efficiently carried out. But the professor seemed more the ringmaster of a circus than a scholar trying to impart wisdom or knowledge. The whole performance seemed to assume that students have no ability to concentrate, and that a constant variety of activities had to be maintained to stave off boredom. If one didn't already have the attention span of a flea before being educated in this way, one certainly would after receiving a steady diet of it. Syllabuses in such classes now run to as many as 15 single-spaced pages with their description of objectives, techniques, activities, and requirements. It would take a New York lawyer to fully decipher their fine print. The use in large classes of classroom performance system transmitters, better known as clickers, is a classic example of the scientific mind's fascination with new technology. Our university purchased the first batch of these innovative devices, I believe, without any clear idea of what they were good for. They quickly put out calls to professors to discover how they might be used and provided incentives for those adopting this costly addition to the old classroom chalk and blackboards. I have observed classes where they are simply used to take roll. Questionable modern improvement on the sheets of paper I still continue to pass around for students to sign. But I have heard that they promote active learning and student involvement in large impersonal classes. But how clickers overcome the impersonality of a large class by having students' individual responses instantly made part of a classroom-wide statistic that is visually transformed into a bar graph is beyond me. What clickers actually do is carry the endless reduction and testing now required in courses to a minute-by-minute process. The rapturous embrace of new technologies has induced even intelligent people to make ridiculous statements about their possibilities. I have had college administrators, who ought to know better, tell me enthusiastically that the young people of today are not like we older folk, that they have miraculous powers to multitask that our classrooms should take advantage of. Pardon me for resorting to the behavior I've just criticized, but studies have shown that it just isn't true. And pretending it is true has caused many people to be killed or maimed on America's highways since the invention of the cell phone and the more recent penchant for text messaging. Dr. Diane Ravitch, a former Assistant United States Secretary of Education, once gave a typically ardent endorsement of the educational virtues of modern technology by explaining how a fictional schoolgirl named Little Eva, who had trouble sleeping at night could get up and learn a little algebra instead. At her home learning station, she could tune into a series of interesting problems that were presented in an interactive medium, much like video games. But Dr. Ravitch, like many promoters of technology, seems to have forgotten everything she ever knew about human nature. Though her little Eva is theoretically possible, it is far more likely that little Eva wasn't sleeping because she was up all night talking to her friends on Facebook. And as a consequence, tomorrow she will probably sleep through her algebra class. Basking in the technological glow cast by experts like Dr. Ravitch, some schools are now doing away with books and requiring all students to arm themselves with laptops. Of course, laptops are far more powerful than any book. They can connect to almost anything in the world. But that's just the problem. As I have seen even at the university level, classroom laptops are far more likely to be tuned into YouTube, ESPN, or worse than the subject at hand. We forget that real people are using these devices, and whatever sheer educational potential they might have will be profoundly affected by what real people will actually do with them. We should remember just how enthusiastically experts praised the educational possibilities of television in its early days. Turn on your TV some evening and see how that all worked out. The reduction of knowledge and even people to numbers is also a characteristic goal of the scientific mind. I've already described how professors are being required to reduce all important knowledge to statistics so that their effectiveness in the classroom can be evaluated. Students, of course, have long been subject to this dehumanizing practice. It all began in 1792, when numerical grades for student work were first employed at Cambridge University in England by a tutor named William Farish. His idea, as Neil Postman has written, that a quantitative value should be assigned to human thoughts was a major step toward constructing a mathematical concept of reality. If a number can be given to the quality of a thought, then a number can be given to the qualities of mercy, love, hate, beauty, creativity, intelligence, and even sanity itself. Mathematics is the language of science, and the dominance of science and scientific thinking today insists that all human endeavors be translated into their mother tongue. Today, students are increasingly defined by the numbers of their IQ, their SAT, their ACT, their GRE, their LSAT, their GMAT, and of course, their GPA. Our university admissions office recently admitted that they have ceased to evaluate most applicants beyond learning their ACT scores and their GPA. Our honors program, though it demands higher numbers, seems to work in much the same way. It is also no secret that law schools inordinately weight the LSAT scores of those who seek admission, because those who give law schools a numerical ranking weight them so heavily. And it is not just students who are evaluated in this way. Sometimes they do the numerical evaluating. My college asks students to evaluate me and my courses on a 5-point scale and calculates my worth in their eyes to the first decimal place. Once a year, my department chair evaluates me even more broadly. I get numerical ratings in the 3 categories of teaching, research, and service, again, carried out to the nearest tenth of a point. Human judgment seems too indefinite and messy. The scientific mind is more comfortable with the specious specificity of such numbers. But if human beings, and not technology, are to shape the future, we must liberate ourselves from the magical power of numbers. We must never regard calculation as an adequate substitute for judgment, or precision, especially a specious precision, as a synonym for truth. I'm not an absolutist about not using numbers to represent human performance. Grades can sometimes be a useful, because practical, shorthand. But we must always remember that they are only a shorthand, a matter of convenience that always obscures something of the actual human person behind the number. Like all reductive practices applied to humans, they are necessarily incomplete, and what they leave out can be critically important. Today, for both practical and financial reasons, we use numbers to represent and evaluate people more than ever before. And we increasingly forget that they are always inaccurate and dehumanizing. We must work against expanding their use, and especially against believing too much in what they seem to tell us. I've taught long enough to see how badly some students are represented by these numbers, for better and for worse, and how unfairly they can be treated because of them. Scientists also tend to worship the new as opposed to the old. Their progressive views assume that anything that is newer must be better than what preceded it. The most common tagline of the television advertisements of my youth was "new and improved." Today, however, one need only shout "new" to attract consumers. The improved is simply assumed. This tendency has many implications for education. It often means adopting the latest educational techniques or technologies without examining their usefulness, their necessity, or their implications. It often means accepting uncritically the latest books, the latest interpretations, and the latest academic jargon. Perhaps most importantly, it also tends to mean favoring research over teaching, because research discovers what is new, while teaching merely communicates to a new generation what we already know. We seem desperate to leave the past behind us. Wendell Berry has aptly criticized our society's obsessive search for originality, its compulsion to seek the new. We appear to hate whatever went before, he observes, very much as an adolescent hates parental rule, and to look on its obsolescence as a kind of vengeance. To many people, the past is now so obsolete that they believe that there is little it can tell us about how to live in the brave new world we are creating. Even to many professional historians, the past appears to be simply a compendium of old-fashioned human follies, suitable only for pointing out how superior we are today and how terribly the people of the past use race, class, and gender to stunt human possibilities. But the past is a soil out of which we grew. It helps us to understand who we are and where we came from. It is the only source we can draw on to plot our course into the future. Without knowledge and understanding of the past, we are all sail and no rudder. I hope that the catastrophic possibilities of this metaphor is not lost on even those of you who haven't been to sea. The scientific mind, because it is steeped in the laws of matter and the language of mathematics, often has little appreciation for the profound value of real human contact in teaching the humanities. It tends to readily accept the substitution of copies for originals, the use of impersonal delivery systems, and the replacement of human beings by machines in the educational process. It sees no problems with using videos or online PowerPoint presentations in place of real teachers. It believes that distance education carried on through the internet is the equivalent of live classrooms. It turns the teaching of whole courses over to computers with few qualms. Of course, there are some skills that can be effectively taught in this way. I recently put a new floor in my den with the aid of a very helpful online video. But those of us who teach such things as history, literature, and the fine arts must rebel at the easy assumption that nothing is lost in replacing people with software or DVDs. Imagine for a moment that you are an Alabama English major who is just enrolled in a course on writing with the Pulitzer Prize winner Rick Bragg. How would you feel if you came to class the first day and learned that he would only be appearing before you in a series of pre-recorded videos? Or perhaps even worse, how would you feel if you discovered that the course was going to be taught entirely online? You would certainly be justified in feeling cheated out of a rare educational opportunity. Yet students are being cheated in this way all across America every day, with scarcely a murmur from most of us. The attenuation of human experience by technology in our world should not go unnoticed, nor should its effects on the quality of our lives be underestimated. The historian Daniel Boorstin saw this coming some years ago when he wrote perceptively about the thinner life of things in the modern era. To illustrate what he was talking about, I ask you to imagine having an engaging conversation over coffee with a good friend. How much less satisfying does this conversation become when you must resort to speaking only over the telephone? The loss of your friend's visual cues and the comforting warmth of their presence diminish the experience. How much more is then lost when you are compelled to communicate only by email? The familiar tones of their voice and the inflections that help you to interpret their meaning have now disappeared. Text messaging, with its curt phrasing and its egregious abbreviations, loses altogether the flow of your friend's characteristic language and much of its meaning. When one progresses, or I should say regresses, to tweeting, one of technology's latest assaults on human dignity, your conversation is reduced to rudimentary bursts of 140 characters or less. By the time your means of communication becomes a classroom clicker, your friendly 21st century conversation has been reduced to little more than an electronic version of the inarticulate grunts that must have characterized Stone Age man. There are times, of course, when some of these lesser forms of communication are all that is possible. But in my experience, we are prone to use them even when we could do better. Just as many students now take online courses when they could readily be sitting in a room with classmates and a real teacher. Education, apparently, is akin to economics, where bad money drives out good. One of the more traditional methods of education that has always demonstrated the benefits of the direct personal impact of one person on another is the lecture. I was particularly happy to be designated as the winner of the last lecture award because it celebrates this time-honored form of teaching. The advocates of our newer practices contemptuously refer to the lecture as the sage on the stage and suggest that we must now consign it to the dustbin of history. Yet if you examine your own experience, I suspect every member of this audience can attest to the fact that a lecture can be a profoundly moving and life-changing event. I can still see the gestures and facial expressions of lectures I heard more than 40 years ago when I was a university student. I can still feel their physical presence and hear their voices. The passion for learning and for life that they expressed in their lectures has stayed with me. Much of my career has been shaped by the inspiration that I still draw from the lectures of many people who have long since passed away. The real test of an education is not an outcomes assessment at the end of a course, but whether students continue to love the subjects they studied and continue to want to learn about them long after they have left the university. Will today's professors, shackled by the technological demands of the educational establishment, still be able to deliver the kind of inspiration that produces these effects? And will today's students in 40 years feel what I feel about my education? Will they still draw sustenance from classes that had the pacing of daytime game shows and were as much about technology as teaching? Perhaps only time will tell, but I suspect that I already know the answer. In fairness, I cannot blame the scientific mind for all the failings of education today. We in the humanities have our own sins to answer for. We seem to want to run to the opposite extreme of science's misguided demand for precision and certainty. We have begun to think that an intelligent person should not believe in anything, and we often use the university to see to it that they don't. Because every good teacher is supposed to challenge orthodoxy and question conventional wisdom, we think that that is all there is to our job. Today, when one asks a newly minted PhD what contribution his or her dissertation has made to scholarship, they are likely to announce proudly that it has complicated our understanding of its subject. That said, they stand there beaming and waiting for our applause, as if confusion were an eminently desirable goal. Those who don't claim to have complicated a subject usually brag that they have problematized it, which is supposed to be equally laudable. But it seems to me that creating problems is almost as great a crime against humanity as it is a crime against the English language to create words like problematized. One cannot fault the young, however, when their elders, the mentors who have guided them along their scholarly paths, are no better. A world-renowned historian at Harvard, recently interviewed about his scholarly purposes, declared that he was keen to subvert established paradigms. Let me repeat that. The scholarly ambition he keenly felt was to subvert established paradigms. His goal, then, was not to transmit a valuable heritage, not to seek understanding, not to convey wisdom, but to exalt his own personal reputation by tipping over someone else's apple cart. He apparently has no keen desire to be of use to humanity, but is only interested in adding another prominent line to his resume. This is originality for originality's sake. The consequence of this kind of education is the constant pursuit of intellectual destruction. All this complicating, problematizing, and subverting is a grand game for the bright scholar bent on professional success, but where does it leave students? At the cost of again singling out my alma mater, I would like to quote a recent graduate of Harvard's Divinity School on the nature of his education there. The latent force of a Harvard Divinity School education, he maintained, was based on the repeated production of uncertainty, vulnerability, disappointment, limitations, ambiguity, and ambivalence. These are cultivated here, he said proudly. They are the quiet virtues of this place. Now, humility in the face of life's mysteries is an admirable virtue that we all might do well to cultivate. But this description of what a Harvard education produces goes far beyond humility. The uncertainty and inadequacy expressed here suggests a person who has been left in a moral and intellectual wasteland in which he is unlikely to be much of a force for good, but might well become an unknowing instrument of evil. If we who teach the humanities are to be useful to our fellow man, then, we must steer a course between the scientist's desire to reduce human life to a mathematical formula and some humanist's nihilistic desire to reduce it to meaninglessness. In doing this, we need to create an educational environment of, by, and for human beings, not one for machines or one designed to make people into machines. And when we seek to improve this environment, these improvements should be freely chosen, not coerced by those who claim a monopoly on truth. We should cease our obsession with the means of education and focus more on its proper ends. We need to help students discover what they can believe in and not just seek to destroy their beliefs. We need to connect students to a human past and not just to a technological future. We need to teach people that innovation is not the only worthy activity, that it is just as important to preserve and communicate to a new generation the best of what is already known. My favorite quotation is one from Samuel Johnson, in which he asserts that men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. This statement speaks to the fact that we already know what is most important in life. We don't need scientific research to discover how to live meaningful lives. And in fact, science can help us very little with this task. Scientific advances have made life more comfortable, healthier, and longer for most people. These achievements are a great blessing, but they do not go to the heart of the matter. Science cannot tell us how to live. It cannot tell us why we live. And it cannot provide us with a purpose for living. It is the task of the humanities to help students to determine these things for themselves. And such a sensitive and important task should be carried on within a caring, trusting human environment, not through machines or at a distance. The achievements of science are the wonder of the modern world. The continued progress of science is inevitable, but what we do with it is not. Human beings must determine when we use it and how we use it. Technology must adapt to human purposes and not the other way around. We must not allow science, with its materialistic laws and its ignorance of our deepest aspirations, to define who we are and what we must become. People are more than numbers, more than complicated machines. As we at the University of Alabama try to live up to our admirable slogan of touching lives, Let them be fully human lives, and let them be touched by human hearts and human minds. Thank you.